This video is sponsored by Audible. Why does nearly every recipe start with dropping a film of oil into a pan? Ever wonder what would happen if you just didn't? Hey, let's find out. Actually, first let's do it the normal way, just for the sake of comparison. A little olive oil in a hot pan, sprouts in, and almost immediately you start to see this nice golden color emerging. Generations of people raised on boiled Brussels sprouts grew to hate them, and that's understandable. You gotta brown them. They're filled with starches and sugars and proteins that brown up real nice if you give them enough time and enough heat. These took 6 minutes to get very brown and tender and quite tasty if I do say so myself. Now let's try to do the exact same thing again, but with no oil. Are they gonna stick to the pan without any oil in there? Not really, not if you keep them moving. Here's our first bit of browning, and check out how different that looks. It's a patch of black with really clearly defined borders. Very different from the broad smudge of golden brown we got with oil. There's a few little brown spots showing up on the cut sides, but much smaller and more localized than the overall browning we got with oil. And one other thing I noticed is that they're cooking very, very slowly. We're at 6 minutes now, which is how long it took to cook the previous batch all the way through, and these are still hard on the inside, nowhere close to being tender. After 11 minutes, I'm giving up. If I cook these any longer, they're gonna burn. Here they are side by side. Oiled sprouts are on the right, and on the unoiled sprouts, you can see how hard I have to push my fork in there. They cooked for nearly twice as long, and they are still not done. Also, their flavor wasn't nearly as good. So, what's going on here? Well, keeping the food from sticking to the pan is, I think, not the most important reason that we cook with oil. Oil, or any kind of liquid fat, has a much more significant role to play in that pan. Let's do it again with the thermal imaging camera. I got some broccoli this time, same basic deal. That film of oil is serving as what they call a thermal interface. The pan surface is flat and rigid. The food is not. So only teeny little bits of the food are actually making physical contact with the metal. The oil essentially reaches up from the bottom of the pan and grabs hold of those bits that are floating just above the surface. And because oil is a tremendously good conductor of heat, energy from the pan is transmitted into more parts of the food than the pan itself could reach. If I pull up this piece of broccoli, you can see that its whole face is really hot, not just the parts in immediate contact with the metal. And look at the nice brown color you get from that. Let's do this again with no oil in the pan, and you can see that the heat on the broccoli is more localized to the few points making actual contact. But also you can see that the overall heat of the food is just lower. We simply aren't getting nearly as much energy in there, and so this is going to take a lot longer. And parts of the outside will probably be burned by the time the inside is tender. Now, fat is not the only thermal interface that's available to us here in the kitchen, right? We also cook food all the time in water. We boil food in water for the same reason we fry it in fat. It's this heat-conducting medium that can wrap itself all the way around the food. And you could use water like oil in a sauté. Just throw down a thin film of it, and it will reach up and fill the gaps between the food and the pan surface, conducting heat up into whatever you're cooking. Water might be the better dietary choice for those of us who maybe eat too many calories, but it has some distinct disadvantages compared to oil in this context. Most cooking oils can get into the neighborhood of 400 Fahrenheit, 200 C before they even start breaking down into substances that aren't oil anymore. Water, under normal atmospheric pressure, can only get up to 212 Fahrenheit, 100 C before it starts becoming something other than water, namely steam. It evaporates and leaves the pan. That's bad for a sauté because you'll have to keep replenishing the water, but more significantly, it's bad because browning reactions cannot happen at such a low temperature. Maillard reaction and caramelization both start around 330 Fahrenheit, 165 C. Under normal terrestrial conditions, water simply will never get that hot. Plus, water isn't as viscous as fat, so it's not going to coat the food as well as oil would. Therefore, in order to use water as a really effective thermal interface, you generally have to submerge food in it. You got to boil it. Or you got to enclose the food in steam. Like, you could put a lid on this pan right now, and that's not a bad way to steam food if you don't have a steamer basket. Without a lid, these are also just taking a very long time to cook. I had them in there for 15 minutes, and they're still not quite quite tender enough. Remember, the ones we cooked in oil took 6 minutes. So now you might be thinking, yeah, well, I guess maybe you do need to coat vegetables in a little bit of oil in order to cook them in a pan. Vegetables have hardly any fat in them naturally. What about something that does, like meat? Why do you have to oil meat? Doesn't meat have enough fat inside itself to cook itself? Well, let's try it. I've got a little piece of sirloin steak here, no extra fat at all on there, just whatever is naturally in the meat. And the first thing I notice, it is stuck like glue to the pan. Meat is mostly water and protein is particularly prone to sticking. Proteins form complexes with metal atoms at high temperatures. They literally bond. Once the surface of the meat is really brown and rigid, you can usually pull it off without tearing up the meat too much. This is going to take some scraping, unfortunately, and yum! Look at that delicious golden crust. I mean, the meat is flat and pliable, so it made much better contact with the pan surface than the vegetables did. But you can still see some of that extreme contrast between the nearly blackened bits that touched the metal and the gray bits that seemed to get hardly any heat at all. There probably isn't enough fat in this meat to serve as a thermal interface, or if there is, not enough of it rendered out into the pan fast enough to coat the surface. Now, how exactly fats prevent food from sticking to the pan, I'm not totally sure. I've read several reputable scientific sources on the subject that don't seem to fully agree with each other. It's certainly true that oils or all liquid fats will spread out across the pan and form some kind of barrier between the proteins and the metal. And because it's such an effective thermal interface, fat cooks the surface of the meat a lot faster and more thoroughly, and a really brown crust releases from the pan much more easily. I also noticed that the whole steak is cooking much faster with oil in the pan, and it tastes way better. There's certainly some other chemical magic that happens between fats and other substances at high temperatures that create delicious flavors. Indeed, we can observe a huge difference even if we take sticking totally out of the equation. Sirloin in a non-stick pan with no oil. There's no sticking, but nonetheless, it's cooking really slowly, and that crust is even worse. At least with the stainless steel pan, the meat stuck to the metal and that held it in contact with the heat. On Teflon, there's nothing to stop big balloons of steam from pushing the meat up, and away from the hot pan, and that's where you get those repulsive patches of gray. Even in a non-stick pan, we still need oil to serve as a thermal interface and for its other flavor benefits. Now I bet some of you are thinking, unfair test. Beef sirloin is a really lean cut of meat. What if you were to cook a fattier cut without any supplemental oil? Indeed, something like Wagyu beef needs no extra fat at all, in my experience. How about this skin-on chicken thigh? I'm putting this into a dry and cold pan, and then I'm gradually bringing in the heat. This is the classic French way of cooking duck breast in a pan. Fat starts to render at relatively low temperatures, so you give it a little head start to melt out some fat before the heat really gets going and cooking the meat. By then, you've got plenty of fat in the pan and the meat can fry itself. Works great with duck breast because duck breast has a huge layer of fat under the skin. I thought it worked okay on this thigh, not as good, probably because there just isn't as much fat. That skin has a bit of that weird mixture of overdone and underdone you get without sufficient thermal interface, probably from the lack of fat at the very beginning of cooking. Not my favorite. But of course, all of this is subjective. I mean, the results are objective, but whether or not you like them is totally subjective. Consider certain Indian-style breads that are cooked in a dry pan. Sorry, this is not naan dough, it's pizza dough, just what I had available, but this is a way that naan is often cooked. Dry pan, no fat. Again, highly localized browning or even blackening. I'll do it again, this time with oil in the pan, and again, generalized golden browning because of the thermal interface. This one with no oil tastes like bread. This one tastes like a donut. I mean, it's kind of awesome, but this one does a better job of replicating the dry heat effects you get from an oven. Speaking of which, do you really need to oil food before it goes in the oven? Let's find out. I've got some mixed vegetables on this tray, fatty beef roast and chicken thighs over here, oil on one side of each pan only, and I'll toss that around to get everything coated. Maybe a little foil snake will serve as some kind of a barrier between the oiled and unoiled sides. Into a 400 Fahrenheit oven, oiled food is on the right. Half an hour later, the vegetables look done, and boy, that is not as big a difference as I was expecting. Both sides got about the same amount of color, at least on top. Look underneath. This parsnip was coated in oil, and the side that touched the metal got beautiful golden brown. I want to eat that. Over on the no oil side, the part of the parsnip touching the metal has some of that same uneven coloration you get without the interface of the oil, a mixture of burned and pale. It's also kind of dry, not as appetizing, IMHO. Back over on the meat tray, wow, the oiled beef looks exactly the same as the unoiled beef. There is an appreciable difference on the chicken, though. The oiled skin looks a little nicer than the unoiled skin. I would guess that's because the skin served as a barrier, preventing rendered fat from pushing up and settling on the surface, whereas the open structure of this beef allowed for plenty of rendered fat to settle on the surface. Yep, oil does not make as big of a difference in the oven as I would have guessed. Why? I'm not totally sure. I intended today's video to be more of a practical guide than a science explainer. If you want more of the latter, might I suggest our friend J. Kenji Lopez-Alt's excellent book, The Food Lab, which you can listen to on Audible, the sponsor of this video.
My dad trained me in the art of making open-faced tuna melts on Saturdays. He also taught me a valuable lesson in how not to cut a block of frozen beef straight from the freezer into steaks. A memorable afternoon that included the line, "Kenji, go get me the hammer."
Don't worry, the science gets considerably more sophisticated from there. And I reckon I'm a slightly more sophisticated person thanks to Audible. I cannot sit with a book as often as I would like to, but with Audible, I can listen even as I'm tearing down acoustical foam forts. An Audible membership gets you access to thousands of audiobook titles, including all the latest bestsellers. You also get unlimited access to the Plus catalog, which is all the back catalog books, ad-free versions of podcasts, and Audible original programs like the Words Plus Music series. These are exclusive stories and performances from some of my favorite artists like Elvis Costello. And new members can try Audible free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/Adam Ragusea or text Adam Ragusea to 500-500. That's all down in the description. Audible.com/Adam Ragusea. Thank you, Audible. And thank you, Fat. It's not your fault I eat too much of you. You're great. In addition to being an excellent thermal interface and anti-stick agent, you're also an essential nutrient, and you facilitate the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins in my body. That's probably the most important reason to cook in oil.